We've come to the final and most important part, the policies. How do we fix the problem of inequality and elite concentration of wealth in the long run? The first step, according to my book and all my research, is to reduce political power. Easier said than done, right? So how do we do this? I've devised a set of policy proposals in the final chapter of my book that try to provide a guideline. But first, two disclaimers. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution, as it's mostly applicable to developed economies where we already have a well-defined democracy and a functioning state. So countries first need to make that transition to having a relatively efficient state and a relatively functioning democracies before going forward. And two, I don't have any direct empirical proof that each of these reforms will work, like I have empirical proofs for other findings in the book. Think of them as just logical extensions of my findings, always open to debate. I won't go into too much detail in explaining each, but I will give you an overview. The common ground is this. We need reforms that rely on the democratic trial and error mechanism and which will seek to rebuild trust in public institutions. That's the desired outcome. I'm using the analogy of a lever. Right? I'm proposing that we apply three of them at the same time in order to achieve the desired outcome. The first lever is reducing political power. The second lever is re-empowering the citizens, so taking some form of power away from politics back to the citizens. And the third lever is re-empowering the community. Again, same logic. Briefly on each. The first lever has 5 policy proposals. Number 1, full transparency of budgetary spending and decision-making to uncover all potentially fraudulent deals between politicians, interest groups, and connected firms. You wouldn't believe how much tension such a small change creates. I've had experience in personally advocating and implementing this in the local government in Croatia. It was an uphill battle, but this improves democratic accountability and trust in government so much, I still consider it one of the most important first steps. So I'm talking about every receipt, every government contract, even all employee salaries, everything out on the open. Number 2, encourage and promote free media and investigative journalism. This is a no-brainer in developed societies and more mature democracies, but it's still a crucial pillar. I provide a few ideas on how to approach this issue. Number 3, introduce term limits for political office and strict conditions that prevent anyone charged with corruption to run for public office. Again, something considered as normal in many developed democracies, but very scarcely applied in general, believe it or not. The last 2 first lever reforms are more oriented towards reducing discretionary political power. This is missing even in the most advanced society. So number 4 is reducing discretionary decision-making power by imposing rule-based triggers and credible threats that can imply immediate punishment of office-holding politicians. Think of it as KPI for politics. The thing that comes to mind is, for example, the Buffett rule for Congress. If the budget deficit surpasses 3%, no one sitting in Congress is allowed to run for office again. Obviously, this is way oversimplified, but think of the incentives such strict conditions can create. So the idea is to define a set of goals for any policy area, whether it's fiscal policy, monetary policy, climate change, health and education outcomes, and hold politicians accountable if the goals are not being reached. How? Read the book. The last first lever reform is to reduce the scope of activities that politicians have the power to influence. This one actually ties very well to the second and third lever, so let's look at that. The second and third lever look to take away some public good allocation decisions from representative officials and give it to citizens and communities to decide for themselves. For example, through the second lever, I propose we implement 3 specific reforms. Number 1 is paying out gross salaries, so before taxes have been deducted, to people who can then decide what they want to do and who they like to support more directly. So each citizen would get like a tax allotment, an option. They don't have to realize the option, but they can keep it default. But they do get an option to decide where their tax dollars are allocated to and what they want to support more directly out of a set of, let's say, predefined choices. The goal is to encourage more direct citizen participation. Obviously, this will take time to get accustomed to, and maybe not everyone will participate, but the benefits could be substantial. The second thing is to introduce participatory budgeting for community public good provision as a way of extending and strengthening citizen participation. So you get to participate in making direct decisions on which projects get built in your community through, let's say, a secure voting app. Also a mechanism that builds democratic capital and teaches people how to improve their local communities. And third thing is something I call punishment referendums. Have you ever heard of ostracism from ancient Athens? They had this idea of exiling a person if they deemed them a threat to democracy. Obviously a bit harsh to implement today, not to mention it infringes basic human rights, but a variant of that would be interesting in the form of a credible threat. So besides election every 4 years, just as an option to induce punishment against an office holder immediately. The third lever builds upon all of these to show how they would work on a community level. Now I encourage you to read about it in the book. To sum up, these set of reforms create their desired first order, second order, and third order effects. The first order effects are obvious. We would get greater transparency and accountability, use technology to prevent corruption, and devise rule-based social policies. Also, we could get more direct engagement of citizens, slow at first, but it will catch on, and ensure greater inclusion of unrepresentative groups, plus more power to local communities. The second order effects develop over time. We can expect to get greater civic engagement, turning politicians into true public servants, thus discouraging all the dishonest ones. And on a community level, the goal is to reduce the number of dysfunctional communities and get greater citizen engagement. Finally, the third order effect would be the outcome that we want. Greater trust, greater democratic capital, better selection into politics, lower incentives for elite network formation, and eventually lower inequality. Too good to be true? Too easy? Not at all. This is a very painful, gradual process with a lot of errors along the way. It's certainly not easy, but I do firmly believe it is the right path. Do you agree with these? Let me know in the comments what you think. Happy to hear all constructive criticism. In fact, I encourage it. Finally, remember that elites are not something inherently negative. Societies need elites. They always existed and always will exist. Just like politicians, we have good ones and we have bad ones. The problem is not their existence. The problem is if we allow them to get too much power so they can skew the distribution of resources and opportunities towards themselves. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. Political power is the root cause of inequality. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope you enjoy my book.